So again, thank you for those who've joined in and dialed in with us. My name's Alex de Ruyter. I'm a professor at Birmingham City University and serve as its director for the Centre for Brexit Studies and related issues such as regional resilience. And hence that's the theme for today's webinar, regional resilience and responding to COVID-19, time for genuine levelling up. It's maybe a provocative phrase, but let's hope we get some discussion out of that. And today it's going to feature myself and Professor David Bailey from Birmingham Business School, Professor Phil Tomlinson from Bath School of Management, Professor Leslie Budd, congratulations Les on the most recent professorship, from the Open University. I'm going to, in terms of the running order, we're going to have Dave set the scene in terms of manufacturing and outlook, and then I'm going to talk about the West Midlands regional labour market with some nods to the wider UK picture. And then Phil is going to talk on expand that agenda further, draw on insights from the southwest of England, and also looking forward in terms of greening the economy and what to do coming out of this. And then finally, Leslie is going to talk around the meaningful devolution, shall we say, in responding to COVID-19 and so on. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to you, Dave, if you want to kick off, please.
Yep, okay, thank you very much. Let me just try and share my screen. I'm technologically pretty useless, as you know well.
Well, we're each going to speak for about 10 minutes, so we'll have to do a bit of timing ourselves.
That's
come up, yeah.
Yep, that's there we go. So I thought I'd set the scene in terms of the macro picture and leave Phil, Alex and Les to talk more about the regional dimensions. I've got rather too many slides, so I'll whiz through them. We know that UK has been in recession. UK GDP fell by over 20% in the second quarter of this year. For the year as a whole, the sort of macro estimates are GDP to fall in the range of 11 to 13%. I'll come back to that later. Now, the economic hit that the UK as a whole has faced is 10 times the size of the hit experienced in the global financial crisis, and double the hit thus far experienced in the US and Germany. There's various reasons for that we can explore. We were late into lockdown. The economy was already flatlining before this started. Because we were late into lockdown and COVID took off, the lockdown was then much longer. There are issues around, according to Rishi Sunak, whether we're more dependent on services than some other economies, although actually we're not that different to Italy and Spain, so that doesn't explain it. What is clear is the UK is at the bottom of the European growth league in as far as we can compare things. UK debt to GDP ratio over 100%, first time since 1963. That isn't an argument, by the way, for austerity down the line very quickly. We saw that in the wake of the global financial crisis, and that really subdued economic growth. So this is a debt we're simply going to have to live with for a long time and try and grow our way out of it. Unemployment is expected to rise from just under 4% to between 7.5% and 10% this year. Alex will talk more about that in the West Midlands context. Inflation is low, although grocery prices are up as people have sort of stockpiled stuff, given concerns over the economy. Remember that this isn't like a previous recession. This is the economics of a sudden screeching stop. The government slammed the brakes on to stop social contact and to stop the spread of a virus. The global financial crisis, the peak to trough fall in GDP was about 6%. Unemployment took actually quite a long time to rise. You know, we've seen a big hit in a couple of months, literally, the biggest hit ever in a few months. That was both the demand side hit, as people didn't go out to shops, they couldn't, and a supply side hit because of disruption to supply chains. We saw the biggest ever falls in confidence measures, although they are coming back in some sectors, but not all. That is in turn going to have a spatial impact given the different spatial mix-up of different regions. There isn't a simple health economy trade-off, as is portrayed in parts of the media, unless we get the health situation under control with a proper test, track and trace system. We are going to be unable to reopen the economy anywhere near fully. Now, we are seeing that in the US at the moment. So there isn't a trade-off. We've got to get this under control as far as we can in order to reopen the economy. And part of the problem we've had, I would argue, we've had a very centralized, privatized track and trace system, which has been contracted out to Serco, rather than working through a more devolved system through public health. You know, the contrast with Germany, where they've got a more decentralized system, is very stark. Huge uncertainty over the shape of the economy. The Bank of England have been talking about a V-shaped recovery, Andy Haldane in particular. Others have talked about a U-shaped or a W-shape in the sense of a second wave, or even an L-shaped if consumer confidence takes a hit. Different effects on sectors and places. We've seen a big impact on certain services where face-to-face contact, proximity contact is important, also manufacturing. Other services which can be provided remotely, like financial services, have taken less of a hit. So because of that, the City of London less affected, West Midlands badly affected because of the reliance in part on manufacturing, but also face-to-face service. So, Birmingham reorientated its city towards retail in the city centre, now had to shut down. OECD argues the UK is going to be one of the worst affected economies this year. We saw a range of policy interventions, monetary policy eased, lots of quantitative easing, Bank of England even buying government bonds and corporate bonds. Big government deficit has been run. Important that continues, and we don't attempt to pare that down too quickly. Government's engaged in lots of loan to companies, although real issues about the banking system. It was only really when the government guaranteed loans up to 100% that the money started getting out of the door. When it was 80%, banks were applying the same credit lending criteria, everything was constipated. Still big issues for medium-sized companies, especially manufacturing, who've had no access to funding. Jaguar Land Rover not supported, for example, even though it's strategically hugely important firm. 9 million workers supported through the job retention scheme. That comes to an end at the end of October. There'll still be around 3 million people dependent on that then. So unless something else is put in place, expect mass redundancy. Also, certain gaps. Recently, self-employed and company directors have been missed out. So a large number of people, despite the Chancellor, I think, doing an excellent job in many senses, some big gaps and the people falling through that net. Coming out of lockdown, we've seen the Kickstart employment scheme. They need to get that up and running as soon as possible. VAT cuts targeted at certain sectors, things like Eat Out to Help Out, although I think that's a bit of a gimmick, to be honest. The job retention bonus is £1,000 to get companies to take workers back on at the end of furlough. Peanuts. If companies think in October the demand is not coming back, £1,000 isn't going to help them. We need to be thinking about something much more ambitious, like a part-time wage subsidy scheme in Germany. Stamp duty holiday as usual to try and get the housing market going. Project Birch was meant to provide finance to strategically important companies. The Treasury have emasculated that. There's only been one loan, so investment so far to Tatar. Some very big gaps here on certain sectors that have been very badly hit, like aviation and automotive. Big contrast with France and Germany, where huge support has gone in. And the big question is what happens when the furlough scheme ends at the end of October? Expect massive redundancies. So there's this talk about a V, but if you look at what's happened, a huge drop, little bit of a bounce back in May, more of a bounce back in July, which isn't on this diagram. Expect to see further growth in August and September as spending is pulled forward because of the VAT cuts. But the issue is then what happens? How far back do we get? And if we look at this recession in historical context, I mean, it's virtually off the scale. It's unprecedented in terms of its scope and size. And given that previous recessions have scarred regional economies, and economies like Birmingham have not recovered that well from hits, I have real fears about how already weak regional economies and weaker cities, how on earth they recover from this. So perhaps that can come out in the discussion. In terms of the recovery that we've seen so far, it's been really led by wholesale, retail, manufacturing and construction. But information communications and professional services still acting as a drag on growth. I don't really understand what's happening there. My guess is that firms are having to really cut non-essential expenditure. That's impacting on professional services. Manufacturing is up, construction up, but a very mixed picture across different services. If you look at manufacturing, this is from the most recent CBI Manufacturing Trends Survey. Domestic and export orders down, but the expectation is that they'll come up. The volume of output over the past or next 3 months down, but the expectation it will be up. Optimism up, but when you look at that bottom right diagram, numbers employed, that's still firmly headed into very downward territory. So, unemployment is a lagging indicator, and it's started to move into negative territory in a big way. That will accelerate. In terms of the budget deficit, in terms of growth, the OBR central scenario is that the UK won't return until pre-crisis levels until the end of 2022. Others now put it at 2025. Even the Bank of England is now saying, actually, it's not going to be V-shaped. it's going to be a lot slower recovery. So Andy Haldane has been talking about a V. Jonathan Haskell, also on the Monetary Policy Committee, said actually we could get stuck and the recovery will be much more slow. Danny Blanchflower, formerly on the MPC, has been talking more about a U-shaped recovery or an L-shaped. And investment managers in the city saying actually we don't think there's going to be a V. We're looking at something probably more like a W. So if we have secondary spikes, further hits to the economy. CBI's take is actually we're probably going to, this is a CBI, hardly the bastion of left-wing thinking, saying actually, yes, the Chancellor's done some good things, but we're going to have to do much more on employment later in the year. Final point, never waste a good crisis. We're going to have to look again at the financial system and how the banking system works. You know, it didn't do very well at getting money out the door to firms until there was a 100% loan guarantee. We've got to think about how we pay our key workers who are in the front line. We probably need to look again at the welfare system. Universal credit is probably going to have to be boosted. There's a lot of discussion about universal basic income, which Alex is working on. The resilience of the manufacturing, the economy as well, hasn't been very good. We've not been quick enough at being able to reorientate to providing PPE, for example. One of the contrasts with Germany is they've got a big manufacturing sector. They can make testing kits very quickly. We haven't. You know, I think the lesson for me is manufacturing still matters. One of the issues which I'd like to explore is really probably we've got to think more about devolution. You know, this centralized response where we've gone for a centralized test, track and trace system has failed. It's going to be better at a regional level. There's going to be questions about who bears the burden in the future, whether we look at wealth taxes, and we can't return to austerity in the way we did in the wake of the global financial crisis. That really killed growth and led to the slowest recovery ever. Don't forget the B word, Brexit is still coming, remember, and if we end up with a messy Brexit and no deal, we're going to take a further economic hit. So we're not in great shape for dealing with Brexit. And even if Johnson's proposals come through and we have a liberal migration scenario, there's still going to be, with taking into account productivity, nearly a 6% hit to GDP by 2030. So that's on top of the issues that we faced already. New book just out, Pandemic, Where Did We Go Wrong? Phil Tomlinson and myself have got a chapter in there. It's available on Amazon, free on Kindle, well worth looking at. On that note, Alex, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. If you stop sharing your screen now, and I'll switch to mine. The format, folks, is that we'll run through all of our presentations first, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. Hopefully, we banked about 90 minutes for this, so it should take us through to about 1 o'clock. Okay. I'll move to my presentation. So thanks for that opener, Dave. That was sharp as always. I'll just stick the slideshow on. Yes. So what I wanted to do there was to dive into some of the labour market data and sort of, you know, set a bit of context here in terms of where we think the trend is likely to be. And I think what I want to say at the outset here is to reiterate what Dave just pointed out in the previous presentation, is that the West Midlands, of course, Birmingham particularly, have suffered due to the effect of previous restructurings. And 13 years ago, we did a study on what happened to the workforce at MG Rover, and I think in terms of some of the data here, they are emblematic. An older workforce who would have moved into less secure jobs that they had, and when the crisis hit, were amongst the first to be let go. So, you know, we have an economy that's been hit by hysteresis here in the West Midlands. You know, it suffered from the effects of previous economic shocks. And I think that's the starting point we have to look at before we consider the impact of COVID-19, which, suffice to say, have made a bad situation worse. So pre-COVID-19, that the region's labour markets, and when I say the region, I really mean the West Midlands Combined Authority area, minus perhaps Solihull, were already displaying, you know, the labour market stagnation in terms of higher unemployment rates than the UK average. Outside of the advanced manufacturing sector, a relatively poor skills base, and we can come back and look at qualifications as evidence of that. And of course, the official UK unemployment rate in January of this year before COVID-19 was about 4%, but of course that's a bit of a misnomer. You know, it's one thing to say that we've had the lowest unemployment rate since 1975, but of course in 1975, the vast bulk of the workforce were employed in permanent full-time jobs, where of course, as we'll see in a minute, much of the labour market growth in the last 12 years or so was characterised by self-employment and other forms of precarious work. So that official unemployment rate at the time concealed the impact of the working poor, of course, with the record use of food banks, and the impact of precarious forms of work. As Dave has pointed out, of course, we have the ongoing issue of Brexit uncertainty and the prospect of a no-deal outcome that I think is most probable at this point, although not necessarily more than 50% probability, but still, the threat hangs over us there. And then, of course, the medium-term challenges of automation and climate change, which seem to have faded into the background in some quarters, but they're there, and compared to the pandemic, which is huge in its impact, but in a sense passing, those two challenges are not going to go away. So, in terms of the growth of different forms of work there, you can see there after the global financial crisis, it was self-employment that really started to kick off. And it was around that time we had discussion on the so-called gig economy as typifying these sorts of jobs. So even well into the economic recovery after the crisis, you could see there that self-employment was still forming a significant chunk of jobs growth, and that the UK, in a sense, is quite distinctive in terms of mature industrialised economies in having this phenomenon. In terms of the precariousness of the UK workforce pre-COVID-19, that's manifested at a number of levels. When I say precarious, I mean jobs that are in some sense insecure and where dismissal is a relatively easy thing to do. You look there, I think one of the most striking statistics here is the 1/3 or so of the workforce, the roughly 8 million employees who had only been with their current employer for less than 2 years. And the significance of that, of course, is that if you had not been in your current job, in terms of 2 years continuous service or more, you were excluded from the provisions of unfair dismissal law. Now, that may be significant in the current context, of course. And of course, we have other categories here, the high profile in terms of dependent contractors, about 800,000 there. And jobs that are not permanent in some way. These are temporary jobs, agency work, casual work. Some of these categories overlap, incidentally. So I think it's fair to say that at least a quarter of the UK workforce were in precarious forms of employment, maybe as many as a third, depending on how you want to measure that. So that's the background UK-wide. If we go to the West Midlands, just to reiterate this point about the region suffering relative, to the UK overall, these are the stats just prior to the impact of COVID-19. If you take Birmingham, the city of Birmingham, the official unemployment rate was 9%, as opposed to the UK average of, what did I say earlier, 4% or thereabouts, 5%. That's a statistic that hasn't really moved much in recent years. If you compare that to about 5 years ago, you're seeing roughly the same. So a slight drop, but nothing significant. So just jump back to the previous slide. What have I done there? So I'll just end share and come back to it. There. So yes, so higher than the UK average for the most part, except Solihull, which of course is a more affluent area. Now, what I wanted to do here was to try and get a feel for the impact of the hidden unemployed. And you can go into NOMA's local labour market data and look up the number of so-called economically inactive people who want a job. And if you do that and you augment the official labour force, then the unemployment rate, depending on where you are, the net effect of that is a 50% increase to a doubling. So if I took an adjusted measure of joblessness, which took account of the economically inactive who want a job, these people may be some who are officially designated as long-term sick, or they may have family duties, other caring responsibilities, which preclude their labour market participation. Then, Birmingham then jumps to over 14%, Wolverhampton 13%, Coventry 12%, for example. That's the state of the local labour market before the impact of COVID-19. So I would say relatively depressed, and of course Birmingham being a local authority of about 1 million people, that average figure will conceal huge disparities between different neighbourhoods. So relatively affluent neighbourhoods like where I live, lower unemployment rate, but then of course real pockets of deprivation elsewhere in the city. Perhaps not surprisingly, fairly well correlated with the Brexit vote. So if we think of the area around where MG Road used to be in Northfield, for example, higher degrees of deprivation, higher Brexit vote there. So in terms of that story then, the number of economically active hasn't increased in Birmingham. All that's happened is that we've seen a falling away of the number of economically inactive. Maybe people who, who've now given up in any sense of labour market participation. Perhaps, the impact of older workers on the scrap heap, for example. But that's where we were. So if we then try and get some feel for the impact of COVID-19 on jobs, we can sort of see that through the number of, the increases in claimant count. So in terms of the combined authority area, that's more or less your West Midlands metropolitan county, we've gone from 94,000 in January of this year to about 170,000 now. So nearly a doubling. You can perhaps see that even more when you look at the percentage of the working age population. So there's clearly been a hit, in terms of the 2.5 million or so across the country who've gone on to universal credit, the vast bulk of whom, of course, will be for losing their job in that sense. In terms of the impact of furlough, I found this a very interesting chart from the ONS, which they're readily downloadable, hence all the bump around it. Looking at the impact of COVID-19 by sector, it's quite striking. I mean, Dave, you put up the chart earlier, those on furlough. What's equally striking here, of course, as many of you may realise, is the incidence of people working from home or otherwise remotely and away from the office, and that's very strongly skewed to the professional services end. So in academia, the business and financial services and other forms of knowledge workers, roughly 3/4 of them essentially working from home. Now, I think one of the things going forward, of course, that will become, more prevalent, I think, is that, as you said, Dave, never let a good crisis go to waste. I mean, it's not been lost on business either. And I think what we're seeing here, of course, as many have attested to, is that COVID-19 has acted to accelerate shifts that may already have been in occurrence anyway. And the benefits of working from home haven't been lost on companies. Why squander a lot of money on expensive city centre real estate if you can downsize? For workers, of course, too. I mean, if you're not spending 2 hours a day commuting, you get more quality time with your family, for example. So I think it's fair to say that going forward, we may see a diminution of working from home, but it won't disappear entirely. And I think, as a lot of companies have attested, Jess Starley from Barclays saying, why pile 7,000 people into an office in the centre of London? We're going to see more working from home going forward, and that's going to have a knock-on effect in terms of the types of jobs that will survive going forward. So in terms of those furloughed workers, the predominance of accommodation, food services, arts, entertainment, the Institute for Public Policy Research, of course, suggests that as many as a million jobs on furlough, to all intents and purposes, those jobs are gone. For these sorts of reasons, the social consumption economy that we had in city centres has been devastated by this, and I don't think it'll ever recover to those previous levels, which may lead one to suggest perhaps certain forms of propping up the subsidies, eat out to help out, maybe a gimmick, a waste of money perhaps. So I talked about the skills point. In terms of the West Midlands, we have an overabundance of relatively unskilled workers. So why am I bringing this into the conversation? I think one of the issues going forward, of course, is that in terms of that greening the economy agenda, there are skills gaps emerging in particular sectors, computing, IT, engineering, and of course in the COVID-19 pandemic, health workers and so on. So we have a workforce here which is potentially available, but underutilised. So at the moment, we have about 5.5 million workers, I think, still furloughed. The IPPR estimate 3 million of them will still be furloughed when the scheme comes to an end at the end of October. And like I said, they suggest that about 1 million of these jobs have already vanished to all intents and purposes. That £1,000 bonus, as Dave pointed out, to retain furloughed workers until January is not likely to be enough for many businesses, especially if we start to time in the impact of potential Brexit scenarios around then. So I think we're all probably singing from the same hymn sheet here, but it's not a bad thing. So, of course, yeah, I mean, I would certainly argue, as others do, maintain and reform the furlough scheme. I think one of the criticisms of the furlough scheme, which by and large has been very good, is that essentially we paid workers to sit around doing nothing. Or in some cases, companies who have been receiving the monies have still been making workers work. But I think we missed a trick here. I think going forward, we do need to be more strategic with these sorts of wage subsidy measures, as they pointed out with the German-style Kurzarbeit. We actually want to use this sort of thing to encourage workers to retrain into emerging sectors and what I think will be more important sectors going forward. And yes, given the essential precariousness of a large chunk of the UK workforce, which has been, most cruelly revealed in terms of the pandemic and having to apply for universal credit and delays in payments. We need to embrace some form of universal basic income. We can argue on the rates or who would be eligible, but the key principle, I think, needs to be universality. And you can implement a basic income. We've written a paper now, we think it can be costed. In essence, it's a modified version of a personal tax allowance, but we need to have that debate. And I think we need to move beyond notions of a welfare system that's founded on the principle that the unemployed are somehow lazy or undeserving. It's all very well for the DWP to want to employ more careers advisors after they shed thousands of them in recent years anyway. But if the jobs aren't there, then this is a bit of a moot point. And actually, I'd go further. I'd suggest that the DWP should be downscaled or defunded, and what it does should be directed more towards a regional and local level. I think local authorities are probably better placed to have an understanding of deprivation in their areas and who needs support than a highly centralised department running out of Whitehall. But I'll leave the devolution section to others. Target support to greening the economy rather than, and I'll just say it, rather than propping up retail, hospitality and the rest of the gig economy. I think that's a bunk economic model. I personally would not be shedding much tears if it were not to return after this is all over. We've built an economy in this country for the last 10 years off the backs of the working poor, which is scandalous, frankly, and we need to move away from that. And of course, then we talk about meaningful devolution. I say meaningful. If I had my way, we'd be talking about elected regional assemblies, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, given the centralising tendencies in Whitehall. But we need to maintain the pressure to add more decision-making and resourcing drop further down the line to the local level. And so on that note, I'm going to say thank you for enduring that. Okay, Phil, I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to you. Phil, are you there? Grand.
Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just want to build on the first two presentations and talk about, set some context, build on some of the context, but also highlight some of the possible opportunities which Alex alluded to at the end of the presentation. So, just focusing on the Southwest for the moment. We know obviously nationally about 30% of the workforce are on furlough. So we've got on this graph here the horizontal axis proportion workforce and the rest is regional data. There's the number of employees in the Southwest and the salary range. And as you can see, it's the arts and entertainment sector which have borne the brunt, and they're the lowest paid sectors as well. Manufacturing up there around about 30%. We've got big concern in the Southwest with aerospace and Airbus located in Filton in Bristol. And obviously that's going to have a double whammy because with the supply chains with Brexit coming along in a few months' time. Some more data here on the left here, similar graph to what I put up in terms of unemployment benefit, similar pattern, not as bad as the West Midlands, but we've had a doubling unemployment benefit claims since March, a little bit of a dip in June, but it's starting to rise again as furlough is being wound down. On the right, we've got this lost generation, which we're really concerned about, is school leavers, A-level leavers. We heard the furore last week, A-lades, but also about those who wish to take up apprenticeships. Now, usually every year apprenticeships comes to an end, and in July you get a spike each year, but you can see this year they've just dropped. They're off a cliff. We've seen very few apprenticeships in the Southwest, and I presume is mirroring what's happening nationally. So big concerns there about apprenticeships and a lost generation. And in response to that, I sit on the West of England Combined Authority Skills Advisory Panel, and and that feeds into regional recovery task force. I believe the West Midlands have got one similar. I think other regions have got other recovery task force, which is bringing together the great and the good business from the combined authorities and universities to try and plot a pathway for renewal following the pandemic, and also to have a strong and consistent message to central governments and representation there to lobby for funding, because it has been the localities and the regions that have borne the brunt of the pandemic and have been involved in dealing with the pandemic. A lot of how to build resilience and how to help businesses adapt to the new landscape, and also to think back to the local industrial strategies, which seems to be so last year really. WECA published theirs about a year ago, one of the first to publish theirs because they're a combined authority. A lot of those for the small LEPs have been shelved or haven't been published because of COVID-19. Ones I've seen, there's no idea about where this funding might come from. It's just a set of proposals, a set of ambitions, as it were. A little bit of a worry that they may just be filed away and forgotten, because we've got a new administration now, Whitehall, since last year. But we're starting to look back and think, how can we refocus on these principles identified and those ideas in the local industrial strategies that LEPs and combined authorities spent quite a bit of time putting together. So roadmap then for long-term recovery, what sort of needs to be done? Well, I know that everybody on this panel and some in the audience will be aware that we have a very fragmented regional government with uneven institutional capacity to deliver recovery, to deliver the local industrial strategies. That's a real issue that we face, and we are awaiting another devolution white paper. I'll leave that for Les. I think Les is going to talk a bit about devolution, and maybe we can discussion afterwards. But that austerity, the last decade, authorities have seen real-term reductions in their funding from the central government grant. They've borne the brunt of COVID response, and they've also seen major shortfalls, or expecting major shortfalls in income. I read that Manchester expecting an £800 million shortfall this year. I know locally Baines, Bath and North East Somerset Council, anticipating a £50 million shortfall, and this is from lost council tax revenue, lost business rates, and also lost tourist income, car park charging and other user fees. So this is a big hole in local government finances. I mentioned as well, we're expected to undertake pursue these local strategies, but the funding arrangements are unclear. And what we do need is a new long-term fiscal settlement for local government and local authorities to build back, to build back better, as it were. However, we've had all the Rishi Sunak has been spending money, or has been a lot of rhetoric about the support has been put in place for the Navy. But there's been quite a few noises recently from the Treasury about we'll have to pare back on this, and there are fears that we may have a second wave of austerity that's down the pipeline. We've got to pay for all this spending that has been put in place to keep the economy on emergency support. So that is a bit of a concern. But looking forward, I think we need to think about how we can promote inclusive and sustainable regional growth. And here we can go back to some of the ideas in the local industrial strategy and the ideas that some of us have put forward in the last few years. And possibly there may be possibilities in foundational sectors such as health, education and energy, which may be the base for a better future. I know Carol Williams and co have done quite a lot of work on this in Manchester in the past. And, foundational sectors often form the base of regional economies, the base of everyday life. But in some of these left behind places, lagging regions, they can account for up to 50 to 60% of local employment. And you know, sectors such as health and education and energy, they're at the forefront of dealing with societal challenges and may be right for social innovation. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on that in a moment. And then in the regard to this as well, there may well be a economies going forward. So if we think about low carbon and energy being a kind of foundational sector, there is a commitment to become a net zero economy nationally by 2050. This, you know, becoming a low carbon economy was one of the part of the grand challenges in the UK National Industrial Strategy, which was published in 2017. And in the industrial strategies I've seen, the local ones, it's the bedrock of a lot of local industrial strategies. Hidden away possibly during the pandemic was a report by the Local Government Association in April about a low carbon future, promoting local green jobs for economic recovery. Currently, there are around about 185,000 people working directly in low carbon energy sectors. But this is expected to rise threefold by 2030 and to around 1.2 million jobs by 2050. And across the north of England could account for about almost 500,000 new jobs. Clearly, the nature of these jobs will vary across regions, and it could be part of the levelling up agenda, because you really want to be building upon your existing regional specialisms and adapting those to more low carbon technologies. So the north of England, for instance, already has some good expertise in generation and storage and of low carbon technologies and processes, and also particularly in nuclear and offshore wind. The Midlands, as David and Alex were have written quite a bit about, you know, is well known for having an automotive sector. It could be geared more to gearing itself up for electric vehicle manufacturer. And in the southwest, we've got we've got Hinkley Point going on. We've also got an emerging low carbon electricity and solar industry as well. And so there'll be jobs here in generation, the installation of new technologies, low carbon technologies, and their maintenance going forward. And these are real opportunities, I think, that we should sort of grasp. In this regard, though, there are significant skills gaps, and if we don't address these, then we'll end up importing products and importing technologies, and we're not going to be to benefit. And there's a key role here for LEPs and local authorities to support skills providers to diversify skills training into low carbon sectors. So in the table here from the Local Government Association report, you can see where these major skills gaps are, which have been identified. The ones in red are the skills gaps in the next 5 years or so, particularly in nuclear and low carbon services, and also in the installation of heat pumps. But some of the local authorities are already making headway into support. So, for instance, Kent have been particularly active. They've been funding skills providers to, who usually train people to work in the construction industry to instead try and add additional support for the delivery of skills for offshore wind. So these are sort of kind of examples of where local authorities can work closely with training providers to diversify in skills provision. But that's on the supply side. Also you need to think about the demand side as well. So public procurement of low carbon technologies is going to be very important in this. This will boost confidence and provide demonstration effects that low carbon technologies can work well and can work efficiently and can be a part of the future. So I know David, for instance, was involved in the past in the cable project in the West Midlands, which was a public procurement of electric vehicles for public bodies, for the health service and university staff to use public sponsored electric vehicles back around 2010-12, which to try and increase the take-up of electric vehicles. Sort of projects are going to be very important. In addition, we're going to need massive investment in low carbon infrastructure. So the National Infrastructure Commission said our report earlier in the summer saying we have £37 billion of infrastructure projects to bid on over the next 2 or 3 years. But even with that, the Green Alliance came back and said, well, actually, there's a 14.1 billion annual gap in low carbon infrastructure funding to 2023. So we're not doing enough on building low carbon infrastructure. And again, that's a great opportunity with the industrial strategy to build capacity if we want to have this green revolution, if we want to build that better going forward. And regions can play a big part in rolling that out. In addition, another sector which has come to the forefront during the pandemic is healthcare. I think initially COVID exposed the UK's over-reliance upon global supply chains for healthcare products. So we saw the UK government, as with other countries, scrambling around to try and get PPE from around the world and vital medicines, that was a big issue. So there may be going forward some opportunities for firms to reshore at least some of this production, and that's going to become more apparent with Brexit when supply chains are going to be hampered with barriers. When we formally come out of the single market next year. But also, I think there's rising concern about carbon footprints as well. So I think we are going to be looking more at reshoring. So there may be opportunities there. In addition, healthcare and social care have risen to prominence during the pandemic. We've got a rising elderly population. So social care is again going to become to the fore. And we're starting thinking more about technology as well, how we can use digital technologies and artificial intelligence to improve health outcomes. So we've seen the emergence of digital health apps, monitoring health conditions, and also artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities using algorithms to use to search through existing drugs solutions for new treatment. So these sort of things are coming to the fore. But at the same time, we've got big issues over funding for social care, which is still not being resolved. I think both political parties have been guilty of that over the years. And also we have significant regional divides, which may make it difficult for some people in some regions to access digital technologies and also affect connectivity. So there are issues there to think about. And finally, we also know that during the pandemic, I think universities started to realize they could play a key role in the response. In the regional response, they often provided advice and worked collaboratively with other providers, such as healthcare providers. So at the University of Bath, for instance, like a lot of other universities, we actually switched some of our operations. So our engineering department was involved in manufacturing personal protective equipment, and the university also provided free accommodation to healthcare staff. And also we've been involved in devising part of these regional recovery plans. I think the way universities have been in the last 20, 30 years, incentive structures in universities has always been to see their global place in the world, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they've often forgotten their local civic role. And there's a big conversation now about how universities can perhaps reorientate a little bit to pay more attention to their local civic role. And we've got these civic university agreements now coming into play. So I think going forward, we can perhaps expect a bigger anchoring role for universities in the future and in the delivery of local industrial strategies. And we've seen good examples of these in other countries, such as Cleveland and in Ohio, and also more locally in Preston, in Lancashire, where they're using procurement to favour local objectives, to promote perhaps some forms of inclusive growth. So I think this is still something that the Centre for Local Industrial Economic Strategies have been pushing for several years. I think we're going to see a bit more of this going forward. So I think I've exhausted my time now, Alex, but hopefully I've opened up some issues for the discussion afterwards, after Les.
Great, Phil. Thank you for that. Okay, can you stop sharing on your presentation, please?
Alex, do you want me to put my?
Yes, please, Les. Because if you just go to the share screen icon there, you can highlight it and bring it up.
Right, it's just hold on. Oh, what? So share screen.
Yep, that green icon should be, I think.
Okay, and then this.
Then you just click on the window or double click on it.
Sorry, let me just go. Sorry. Double click on
your presentation.
No.
No? I have it. I can bring it up on my screen.
I'll have to tell you to swap screens, yeah?
Yes.
For each. Yeah, okay. I'll leave it to you because it's
right.
Just not.
Okay, I'll bring yours up then. Excuse me, folks. Apologies. Just bear with us for a couple of seconds. Yeah. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yep. So can you put it up?
Yep, full screen. Here it comes. Okay.
Okay.
So just tell me when to move on to the next slide.
Okay. So right. Well, thanks for the invite, Alex, and thanks for the previous presentation. So I want to pick up some of Alex's remarks, Phil's remarks about devolution and the possibilities, but also to do with COVID-19. Now, originally, as I'm not a clinician, I didn't want to get involved in COVID-19 research, but it's inevitable because of its impacts. So what we've seen is the rise and fall of regional shock absorbers in the UK, and today I'm concentrating mainly on England because there's a kind of devolution deficit there, something we could learn from the other devolved nations. So traditionally, the management of macroeconomic policy has been either policy discretion or automatic stabilizers, including taxation, public expenditure, etc., etc. And that should cushion the impact of external shocks. But sustaining the same level across England in the provision of merit and public goods, health, education, I would say transport, should act as regional shock absorbers. But the question is why, particularly in the last 15 years, well, no, say the last 10 years, why are there distinct differences in the regional distribution and the provision of these goods, especially health, which has been exposed brutally by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also we've also seen in the distribution of A-level results. There's a distinct geographical distribution in the differences, which also could be actually aligned with the increasing regional socioeconomic inequality and spatial inequality in the UK. So the devolution dividend in the last 20 years has been very variable, uncertain. We've had a fairly incoherent inchoate institutional basis policy. That's been reinforced by and exacerbated by localized regional hysteresis of the legacy effects of the demand shock of the GFC, with many regions only in the last 18 months getting back to GFC levels of income per head. So COVID as a demand and supply shock has exacerbated deprivation and lack of well-being, again reinforced by austerity. So, but paradoxically, could this major external shock be the agency to finally address the socioeconomic and spatial inequality, or will everyone have to migrate to London to increase health and socioeconomic outcomes, as someone we know at LSE well seems to suggest? Next slide, please, Alex. Now, this map, and I keep telling people I'm not a geographer, but I do like maps. This map is a geographical variation in vulnerability of health, and it's part of a report, an excellent report I recommend everyone to read, by the Institute of Fiscal Studies on the geography of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, they have come up with a methodology and to measure, and they've got 3 stages of vulnerability: health, labour market and family. We come on to the other 2. The vulnerability is measured for health in the proportion of population over 50 and underlying health conditions. Now, this is obviously the underlying story. This is much more complex. You have to take into effect income differences, wealth, access to public services, merit goods. But also it also reinforces the postcode lottery of health provision. And I'll come on to that later on. Next slide, please, Alex. Next slide. So health outcomes of regional life expectancy by region: least deprived, most deprived. And as you see, London is, even in the most deprived areas of London, life expectancy for males is increasing. I'm hoping these slides will be available so people can actually look at them in detail, but I don't want to go through each one. But again, in the northeast, you're seeing a decline in health life expectancy for males between 2010 and 2018. And you could match that to, I'm sure you could actually match that to joblessness, economic activity, socioeconomic, underlying socioeconomic problems and health problems. If we will go to the next one, which is for females, Alex. Again, we see with females, again, it's the same kind of regional picture, a bit more spaced out for the most deprived. But as a clinician said, a friend of mine said, if you're going to be ill in London, because the major hospitals in London had full PPE equipment. And my visit to a hospital about 3 weeks ago, local hospital, it's a world-class teaching hospital, you actually saw that they were getting back to normal health, whatever normal is, normal healthcare provision, quicker than elsewhere. So you're actually seeing not only just socioeconomic inequality, but the deprivation, lack of deprivation, and the increased well-being having a distinct regional distribution, which has got worse since 2010. Next slide, please, Alex. So this is the geographical variation in vulnerability to workers. So the index for workers is the labour market vulnerability, which is to do with the proportions of shut down sectors in those regions. And again, we see the kind of same reinforcement as we see in health deprivation and health outcomes to start with. The family vulnerabilities tend to be the numbers of people receiving free school meals and the relationship of families to social services engagement at the local authority level. These are all local authority data. And of course, you'd expect the centres like Manchester and parts of London to be high on that. It's interesting elsewhere. but there's a sense in which, to the degree to which families are a better basis for managing vulnerability at the local authority level, which then suggests the point that's been made earlier, that the basis of governing, if you like, the impact of COVID and measures afterwards is much more localized than regionalized. There's an irony there about vulnerability of families in the Isle of Wight at the bottom, but apart from tourists, the Isle of Wight is a relatively poor place. So, and also sparsely populated. So there's some conclusions could be made about why would you test, given its population density, have that as the basis to test and track COVID-19. But that's again, that's a policy issue. And if we go to the next slide, Alex. That's distribution of infections. It's very surprising, they've got no data for Dorset, but Dorset is very low. It also has one of the highest, actually East Dorset has the highest life expectancy in the UK. And that tends to be wealthier retirees, although there's a change in the distribution there. So to date, from last week, there were 1,493 cases of COVID-19 and 130 deaths. So although they say there's no data, and I think that might be to do with the reorganisation of local authorities down there. Next slide, please, Alex. So this is the distribution of Dest as of May 29. This is ONS data because the variability of other kind of deaths. And again, distinct patterns. Greater Manchester has been relatively high, parts of London, as we've seen below, and Dorset very low. So I just come to I just wanted to show that distribution. I'm not a health economist, but it is quite interesting to tie these things into wider issues of the regional distribution of socioeconomic deprivation and well-being. So the last slide, Alex. Please. Right, so you've got, there's a tendency to treat places, some of all these characteristics, as homogeneous in response to shocks like COVID-19. And the centralising tendency of this government is to treat it the same. And in the same way, outsourced test and tracing to professional service companies like Deloitte and Serco, whose record to date in terms of their contracts has been less than stellar. But capabilities and characteristics of capacities do differ. And obviously, their sexual makeup, market accessibility, and potential infrastructure. As a basis of whether you can actually combat deprivation, lower well-being, and lower health outcomes, clearly the two are linked. And many of the kind of issues that Phil was talking about, industrial strategy and green energy. So, for example, there seems to be a twin strategy about electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. And in the northeast, because you've got the bounty of weather, offshore wind energy generation, they're now generating what's called green and blue hydrogen, both of which could help the target of zero carbon economy by 2050. But devolution has been manifested
I think Les may have dropped out. Are you there, Les? Just sorry, folks. I'll give them a few seconds to try and dial back in. No? Okay. Beth, can you try and contact Les, please? Maybe just email him or something just to alert him. Okay. I'll stop sharing the screen for now, folks. I think we'll try and re-establish contact with Les. I think just to wrap up his concluding point there, we have a bit of time for questions. If Les dials back in, we could cut to the, the concluding statements for his talk. And now I would like to invite participants, anyone with a burning question, let me know, please.
Can you hear me, Alex?
You're back. Yes, I can.
Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
I'll bring your screen back.
Yeah, sorry, something.
All right, I'll try and bring your screen back. 2 seconds. There we go. Okay.
So when was the last statement? Was it dog's dinner?
I think it was, yes.
Okay. So it is very clear that a number of the concern is about levelling up is, again, you'll have a set of ad hoc measures, some funding thrown at some places in order to preserve the seats of Tory party MPs that was won and ended the Red Wall. Now, in an environment of limited fiscal powers and incomplete and sometimes non-existent institutional government, funnily enough, the pressures for decentralisation have tended to reinforce re-centralisation, and that has been exposed. And so there's a challenge for all policymakers for actually a modernising political project of an England of the regions, if you like. So the dilemmas of devolution have been exposed to reinforce the imbalances in the UK, particularly in England. So a change is going to come or have to come, to quote the Sam Cooke song. Now, for years, I've talked about regional bond markets and targeted responses. But actually, if we extend the idea from the Centre for Local Economic Strategy of the concept of community wealth and assets, which also includes health and well-being, and including the localisation of health provision, not care commissioning groups, but local authorities, GPs, as a basis for texting and tracking, we can link health outcome better to some kind of regional governance. The danger is that you have a case of, like, Greater Manchester Partnership for Health and Care, that they take on that responsibility. And my analogy is the way in which a lot of universities took on medical schools because there's a basis of research and income. Health is expensive and complex, and grand partnerships may actually undermine the benefits of localized and regionalized devolution of healthcare and related socioeconomic outcomes. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Les. All right. Well, I hope that provided some interesting and challenging material for people. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I'll throw it up to the floor. Beverley, I see you putting your hand up first. I can't see everyone on screen, so do use the chat function as well if you wish to alert me. Yes.
Thanks so much. Well, I'd like to thank all the contributors, the speakers. Really enjoyed your presentations. Thanks so much. My question or comment really relates to the launch of the book, our book, English Regions After Brexit. A week or so ago, when we had both Lord Heseltine and Professor Vernon Bogdanor commenting on the likely outcome for devolution in England being a combination of enhanced devolution to the combined mayoral authorities, along with a unitary model for the shires. As we know, the combined mayoral authorities is 13% of the landmass at the moment. And the shires are obviously the greater bulk of the landmass, and the idea was the shires would maybe get a unitary with a mayor, but clearly that doesn't equate in any way with a devolved nation and the powers that the devolved nations have, as we've seen today with education and the responses of the devolved nations to the A-level fiasco. So I just wondered whether you felt, as the speakers, that we were showing, perhaps as a lobbying and policy arm, lack of inspiration and vision about what England could really have in order to overcome some of the problems that you've so aptly highlighted.
Yeah, can I touch on that first then, Beverley, and I'll let the other participants come in with their views. You've highlighted a very important point here, is that the paradox of decentralisation, as the government would purport to have it, is that we have an emasculation of the planning function at local authority level, frankly, which I think is just being driven by developer agendas. You know, it's as simple as that, coupled with a proposal to obliterate district authority councils and swallow them all up, probably at the county level. You know, as you say, in the form of unitary authorities. To me, that does seem development driven, to the extent of encroaching on green belts and having more development take place outside of the city centres. You know, I think that's something to be wary of if we could do brownfield filling in first. But it's this diminution of autonomy and this centralisation to Whitehall that concerns me, because to me, it does fly in the grain of genuine devolution if you're stripping away more of the decision-making ability from the local level. Politically, I'm not really sure how abolishing district authority councils will fly in the Tory party ranks. I suspect there'll be some quite degree of opprobrium about it. But yeah, for me, it's a bit of a sham. I mean, I would like to see more genuine devolution of resourcing and decision-making down to the regional level. And for me, that the region is coterminous with NUTS 1. You know, the West Midlands, such as the old Regional Development Agency, Advantage West Midlands encompassed. You know, I'd prefer to see it return to that kind of model with democratic accountability. You know, but we're not there yet. Not under the current regime.
I don't know if I can come back in, because I'd be really interested in Les and David and Phil's views too.
Yeah, please.
But I mean, I was interested in Professor Bogdanor, who repeatedly said the regions are ghosts in England. There is no federal spirit in England. And I felt it was interesting that the probably accepted view, perhaps among some of the policy leadership in the country, was that it's quite okay for England to have a bunch of unitary authorities and a few mayoral combined authorities or combined mayoral authorities, whereas the devolved nations can actually make some real decisions and even raise perhaps some tax, you know, levies too.
Yeah, Jens, do you have any comment there?
Well, Werner Bogdanor should know his history better, because this is one of the great myths. I mean, the second volume of the Kilbrandon report set out that there is strong regional identity of the old standard regions. The problem is this, you know, the constant rebounding. One of the things that came out from Brexit is the need for a new constitutional commission to look at this. We won't get it. But part of the problem I think he's talking about is what Disraeli talked about, unfortunate regionalism, as he associated with continental Europe. And in the 19th century, the county councils were basically kept to set up as a bulwark about encroachment of urbanisation. But the English, and I stress it's English, and I'm half Scottish, the fixation with mayoral leadership is the grand old Duke of York syndrome, leading people, you know, this singular person. And in the same way, we still have personality politics, although we're meant to have cabinet government. These things will come and go. My view is that we will have an independent Scotland and some shift towards a closer union between the north and south of Ireland, and that leaves a governance deficit. And if you want to do, unless you want the Henry Overman view that everyone should meet to London and South East, you are going to have proper regional governance and resources, because you're going to have a political problem otherwise.
Can I just come in?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be involved with a project that Ron Martin ran, and Ron's here, so say more about it, the ESRC City Evolutions Project. And what was really striking in studying Birmingham was the constant churn in institutional setup. You know, you go back to the West Midlands County Council, then the City Council, the RDA, then back to cities, now the West Midlands Combined Authority. Yeah, it seems to last a few years. You start to do good things, it gets scrapped and reorganised. Can we have a proper constitutional convention that really sets up a federal England, and that we work out responsibilities in different levels? And I would agree with Alex, it's about more responsibilities and powers locally. It's interesting, for example, the West Midlands Combined Authority has gone to London through this regional task force with a set of asks, But why are we in the position where we have to go to London asking for stuff? Any other country in the Western world would have had enough devolved power to get on with it. We are so centralised. So, and it's not just about powers locally, but we've also got to come up with a system of redistribution. I think the danger here is that we go for this kind of piecemeal devolution where city mayors can cut a deal with the centre if they can prove they might save the centre some money, which is what seems to be driving this, and we forget about the redistribution as well. So I'd like to see a proper constitutional convention and a federal England as well as a federal UK.
Any further questions? Ron, you come in now, Ron, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got so many points. I have to be very selective.
All right, just pick one or two, please, mate.
Okay. It does seem to me with the financial crisis, now this COVID, and then Brexit coming up, we have reached a sort of historical juncture where we actually need to have a major rethink of the spatial foundations of the British economy and its governance structure. You know, and I think we're in danger of tinkering around the margins yet again. Now that may be, it's all we can do. I mean, there are some people argue we've got to build on what we've got and try and extend that and broaden it. That's okay, that's one solution, but I think that the time has come, and it's really echoing what what was just said, that, you know, I think, and David, I think we actually need a complete rethink of the territorial governance structure of the UK as a whole. And there's nothing new, as has been echoing through the literature and the debates for decades, and perhaps the time has come. Another remark I have relating to the recessions is that the nature and the shape of it, we've got an exceptional recession at the moment because of the lockdown. When we start delocking and so on, we may well then revert to what you like call a normal recession. And so it could actually linger on for some considerable time. By the way, there's never, ever been a V-shaped recovery. They're always L-shaped, and you lose output permanently. So, you know, that's a myth, the V-shape. It's going to be much more complicated than that. And a final point, I've got many others, but I will just raise this, is that when I've noticed the idea of regional recovery plans, fine, but that's a short-term way of looking at things. And I think what you actually need is really, you know, a longer-term regional revitalization strategy rather than recovery. You know, there may be a short-term and a long-term aspect of this. To get the economies working again in the short term is vital, but that's got to be fed into and part of a longer-term strategy, which takes me back to my first point. And very finally, levelling up and left behind places. What are we levelling up to? You know, there's been no real discussion of that, except Boris says and up towards nearer to London. You know, well, okay, that may not be feasible. This is a debate we need to have as geographers and regional studies people. What do we mean by that? And likewise, left behind places. They are not homogeneous. There's a whole heterogeneity of left behind places, all with their own particular problems and dimensions. And we need to discuss that too. You know, so I think it's all part of this major rethink we need. You could say, well, we haven't got time to do that. We need to recover. That's true. But I think the time surely has come for the academic and policy community to really press for a major rethink about the nature of the British or UK economy, how it's governed, and the whole idea of devolution. Be wary of devolution. A lot of things I've seen on the screen today are not devolution, they are decentralization. You know, so true devolution is something altogether different. I mean, the German case is much nearer to a real devolution. And be wary of what you hope for. America has a certain degree of devolution, and you've got about 20 or 30 American cities that are bankrupt. You know, so you still need, as David, I think, hinted at, a centralized redistributive mechanism to support a high level of devolution. But I'll stop there. I've got lots of other points, but it's been a great discussion. Thank you.
No, that's all right. We may have time to come back to you, Ron, depending on if Jens, any particular comment there you wish to rejoin on?
Can I just stand? I mean, I some of the points there, Ron and David and Les. And this has been going on even in my lifetime. You see all the changes at local government level, and just the last 10 years, we've just ended up with a highly fragmented structure. And it was throwing some skepticism out there is how, I do agree, we do need a commission. We do need to look at the federal structure of the UK again and finally get something right. But the skepticism is how practical is that going to be at local government level, police commissioner elections, combined authority elections, mayoral elections, it's very low. I mean, the populace doesn't understand what each authority does. They don't know, many are not aware of who LEPs are and what responsibilities are. This is a big challenge. And whenever you get proposals to, or we need a new regional body or a new mayor, there's always a lot of skepticism out there. There's a lot of skepticism we have to, you have to fight back on. And a lot of powerful interests who will fight against it. I mean, go back to where Dominic Cummings got his teeth. It was fighting the referendum for an elected body in the north. Just throw that out there. Is that there will be a lot of skepticism, a lot of opposition to any future reorganisation or commission.
Yeah,
I'm not saying
right.
we shouldn't do it, but just to be.
I think that's right, Phil. The irony there, of course, is his later motto was "Take back control," but he'd opposed it at a regional level.
Guys, can I cut to Ozge from Birmingham City Council? I think I've just seen her put her hand up. Dave, we can come back to you pending. Ozge, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, and yeah, thank you for sharing the assessments. And yeah, we all agree that it's a challenging time. And however,
Ozge, are you happy to introduce yourself to the fellow participants?
Yes, of course. Yes, I'm Ozge from. I'm the Brexit program manager for Birmingham City Council. So, so I've been following your work closely and have been conducting some assessments myself for the council and the impact of Brexit and of course Brexit readiness at the local level. And so. And this is actually what I would like to hear more about from you. So I remember a workshop we had actually a couple of months ago. You know, we were discussing back then the economic shock and response to the economic shock linked to Brexit. And we see that what we expected in 2021 is happening now in a different shape or form, and of course with different consequences. However, as Brexit is not going away and the impacts are still there, I would be very interested here to get your view on some direct links on the assessments you've made. So because if I look at Birmingham and the council, so a lot of things that you have actually brought up as gaps or as areas where we need to concentrate, such as support for SMEs, skills gap, employment, youth employment. For example, those are all the services that in case of Birmingham City Council, but I believe that it's the case across the piece for all local authorities, are actually services provided by the EU funds, the EU structural investment funds. Mm-hmm. And actually, according to a report that the UK was supposed to receive 22% more in the next budget period, even independent from COVID. This was an assessment made in January 2019, because the situation was already, not, getting better. And if we look at youth employment, West Midlands was already identified in 2014 as one of the 5 target regions in the UK to focus on for youth employment. That's why there's this youth employment initiative, again, funded by the EU, and it is at the moment still ongoing. And let alone the services being provided, again, if we look at Birmingham, we even face some some challenges in terms of keeping our staff, because those that staff is funded again by those projects, and we're looking at roughly an estimation of 1.5 million redundancy costs on top of everything else. So and then we also discuss a little bit like devolution and trade, and I'm sure you all are familiar with the recent white paper on UK's internal market. So I think what we don't discuss enough is that leaving the EU or Brexit is not about a trade deal. This is like a full transformation of a country and also decision-making mechanisms. powers in 160 policy areas will be transferred from Brussels to devolved administrations, and there's still no framework or no baseline for a common agreement. How are we going to set our standards? And some of them are actually, we're already experiencing with education, with response to COVID, but there are, you know, even more pressing issues than that. So and then we also briefly discussed the universities, research and development, low carbon. Again, we're talking about EU structured funds and Horizon 2020. So there are very, very close links, and that's why I would like to, you know, hear your views, you know, based on all the assessments you've made and the situation you've presented. So where do you see the direct links, and where do you see the, you know, the next steps that need to be taken? I mean, I fully agree with the overall approach and the challenges and the question around evolution, but Brexit is happening in a couple of months, and there are some very, very concrete next steps we should be thinking about, and would be happy to hear your views. Thank you.
Thanks. No, it's a look. Without trying to sound funny, it's a lot to respond to. Yeah, go on, Dave. If you've got a
yeah, I mean, they're really good points. I mean, if you think about places like Birmingham, which suffered extreme deindustrialization during the 1980s, they actually went to Brussels, the European Union, to get support. You know, Thatcher reluctantly agreed to that, but there's been a tremendous investment through Horizon 2020, European Social Fund, various forms of regional policy, not forgetting as well for many companies in the region, the European Investment Bank, which has provided support for research and development. So there's big issues about that, and how on earth that is going to be replaced. And things still aren't clear in terms of, you know, shared prosperity fund and what's coming next. The trade deal is still important though. So, you know, if there is not a trade agreement, the economic shock will be even greater. Now, the sort of trade deal that Boris Johnson is now going for is a very thin one, so there's still going to be disruption. You know, there's going to be customs delays, there'll be impact on supply chains, there'll be a hit to manufacturing in the region, particularly automotive, aerospace and others. But if there's no deal at all, it will be even more pronounced. So, you know, that the economic shock will be great. Now, the issue there, of course, is that economically, we're in a weak position, so we're getting a shock on top of a shock. But in a sense, from the government's point of view, the potential disruption from Brexit is masked by COVID. So trying to untangle the impacts of that isn't going to be at all clear. They're going to have political cover, essentially, I think, for doing it.
Sorry, Les, can I chip in first here? I mean, I'd pick up on that point, Dave, because you talk about the hit to long-term growth over 15 years. You know, in the short term, people may well not notice, but you know, a zero tariff trade agreement doesn't preclude, you know, checks at the border. Yeah, Les, come on, pick up then.
I was going to pick up because, I mean, clearly that COVID-19 is hit the propulsive industries of the metropolitan regions, and you have a propulsive industry as a basis of sustaining activity complex economies type of agglomeration economy. So that's being hit in key sectors, and those key sectors would also be the basis of greening the economy, etc., etc. The other thing is that Brexit would the biggest hits from the GFC and now have actually been low-level service economies and insecure employment. So, you know, restaurants, all those kind of services are being hit that will likely be exacerbated. But one concern with no deal is food tariffs. The government is saying they won't impose food tariffs, but others will. So, you know, you can link the impact of Brexit locally and regionally through a no deal impact on food prices. And it's a disgrace that in 2020 we have food banks. So I think, you know, that double whammy we talked about, but even the regional basis of recovery, if that's a possibility, is certainly undermined in particular kind of places.
Okay, I know that we're officially due to stop at 1 o'clock, but I'm happy to carry on a bit. I mean, if people wish to hang around a bit longer, unless you've got any pending commitments elsewhere. Look, can I just say something here, Ozge? I really worry. You know, you've highlighted the fact that a constrained local authority like Birmingham City Council is really up against the wall on this. And the material that we've put forward to date in terms of the near future just suggests it's going to get worse. And the only thing I could say to try and mitigate that is the notion that the longer this goes on, and specifically COVID, the more the government, I feel, and the governing party will be dragged away from their free market comfort zone. Yeah, and it may be somewhat tongue-in-cheek to say that, you know, the political party concerned favours being in power above everything else, then so be it. I mean, that to me is the only sort of silver lining on the clouds. I don't think at the end of the day they're going to have much choice if, you know, as we expect at the end of October, we start to see unemployment ratcheting up to the levels predicted. And I think it will force their hand, because the alternative would be rising civil unrest. And I don't think anyone would want to see that happen.
No, I think the danger with that, Alex, if you don't mind me jutting, is I think we'll end up with kind of piecemeal pork barrel politics where the government puts money in on training or infrastructure into the seats they've won in the red wall to hang on to them. And we won't end up with a proper regional recovery plan. I mean, I think Ron's point earlier was really important, because, you know, Ron's done the fantastic work on different dimensions of resilience. This isn't just about bouncing back. It's about reorientation and renewal. And for me, the really interesting work that was done by the Regional Development Agency in the wake of the global financial crisis wasn't just the immediate help. It was about trying to get us onto a new development path with some success, with limited success. But that's all gone. We don't have an agency to do that. And if we look at the West Midlands Combined Authority, it only actually does transport. 300 staff, 275 of them on transport.
Yeah, there's a very interesting sentence in Boris Johnson's New Deal speech in June 2020, where he says, "We just don't want to bounce back, we want to bounce forward." Now, he needs to be really taken to task on what he means by that. You know, and it's something we can pin some quite cogent arguments. Well, you know, what do you mean by that, and what do we mean by that? And I think David's absolutely right. I mean, you know, the Core City Group in particular, which I work with quite closely now, I mean, they are increasingly interested in actually what they regard as building resilience, you know, as part of the strategy. And building resilience is not a one-off activity. You just don't say, oh, now we've got a resilient economy. It's an ongoing thing. And it links into having a longer-term development strategy. And one of the most interesting books, I don't know if you've read it at all, on the resilience dividend by Judith Rodin, who was at the UN. It's an absolutely fabulous book. I mean, it's a very much a narrative of examples around the world about how you build resilience. And there's some really interesting sort of guidelines there in terms of what a community or local economy or a firm or whatever needs to do to actually be resilient. And, you know, it's well worth reading actually, because there's some real good signposts there. But it is an ongoing strategy, an ongoing sort of, you know, policy objective. It's not a one-off thing. But I think, you know, in terms of bouncing forward, take up one or two other points that have been raised. David's made the point about, you know, we need some sort of manufacturing revival. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we're one of the most deindustrialized nations in the world. We have lost most of our sort of domestic supply chains. They've all been geographically dispersed, and we've seen what happens if you get something like the COVID thing or the Brexit. They're highly fragile. You know, so there is now an interesting argument about the extent of reshoring and building up local industrial ecosystems. You know, this is not to be so sanguine, you know, we can really boost manufacturing employment, and scope for that is probably quite limited, but we can certainly build up manufacturing capacity. And I think that's something which would be part of a strategy. And this would help certain regions, you know, and localities around the country as part of a national strategy too. So I think a really strong case needs to be made about reindustrializing, let's use that phrase, to a certain extent. You know, particular areas around the country have got the capabilities. They've lost some of them, but that seems to be another very important element of the strategy. So I agree entirely with your point, I think, Alex, when you made it, that, you know, we've built the economy of the last 15 years on the backs of very low wage employment types, you know, in sectors that, okay, you know, they might thrive in good times, but they become particularly precarious in crises. And in the long run anyway, they're not the basis for a long run development. You know? No, they're not. I mean, there's, you know, everywhere can't do this anyway. But Yeah, I'll bow out there. I've got to go actually. So thanks everyone very much indeed for a very interesting discussion. And are the slides going to be put on?
Yes, we will. Yeah, we'll make them available through various fora. Beth will put them up on our website, and we can also email them around participants. If you contact us, we can do that. So yes, they will be. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.
Bye.
Can I pick up on that reindustrialization and how actually you attract investors for new kinds of activities? So I mentioned the hydrogen economy, and there was a very good paper in the Guardian about blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, and given the chemicals legacy of the northeast of England. But again, there's a whole issue about picking and choosing by central government. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So, for example, in terms of stuff I've been working on the space economy, not geography, but the way in which we lose Galileo, the links to the automotive, so a lot of the experiments that have been done on the International Space Station, which will boost lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicles and smart city technologies. But again, if we go back to contract deals, will the only smart city in the UK be Milton Keynes, when it maybe should be, I don't know, Wolverhampton? So the concern is, unless you have an institutional basis both for raising funding and sustaining community assets and wealth, it will, you'll have a system of almost prefects who will do central government's bidding. So I think there's a fundamental issue about addressing that as part of reindustrialization, but also going back to a constitutional convention.
Thanks, Les. Yeah, look, I mean, one other thing I wanted to pick up on was the way that this is really hitting young people. I mean, Ozge, you referred to youth unemployment there. If I look at the skills shortages in the region, you look at Sandwell, just to pick an example, with a 17% of the working age population with no formal qualifications at all. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the crisis, it's really hitting our young people. It's not unrelated to the structure of the economy. A lot of them work disproportionately in areas like hospitality and retail, the very sectors that taking a significant hit. We desperately need a new deal there to, if I can use that term, to for the 16 to 24-year-olds in particular, and not just the graduates who are facing difficulties, but those who didn't get to go to university in the first place are really now finding it hard. Any further comments, people?
Well, on that, I mean, if you've actually looked at the health stats on the increase in mental health problems for younger people, and actually in terms of any sort of second spikes, if you look at America and you look at France, for example, it's in the 25 to 40 age group, and they're actually also getting the worst symptoms. It's not the mild symptoms, so they're doubly vulnerable in terms of unemployment training, but also their health outcomes. And this could be a generation that has lower health outcomes than previous generations, which is a significant. So in terms of the political shock of COVID-19 and addressing that, and obviously the thing about housing as well, is crucial.
Yeah. Okay, anyone have any further comments or questions? Beverley, have you got your hand up there? Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, thanks. I mean, it's just a query really to our contributors. Just how do you see, or can you recommend any further, sources of literature around place-based economic and well-being development, as opposed to sort of the whole national, the way we've done it globally structured?
Yeah, I can, because I'm the book series editor of the Expo series, and we've got the new regional studies book coming out by Andrew Beer and co on place-based policy. I think Alex has got your details, so we'll pass that on to Sally,
send the link,
so we can get you a compliment. So I can. That's coming out. That is in print at the moment.
Yeah,
in fact, I think it's the online version is out now. So. But we'll get that out to you.
Well, there's also that also builds Andrew was central to the place-based leadership network. And one of the issues again in COVID-19 is the degree to which, particularly in Italy and in France, is place-based leadership. And what was interesting about the mayor is the mayor of Leicester comes out as a public figure that no one's heard of. So I think even though the paradox of mayors, they could actually be important figures in place-based development and place-based leadership.
Okay. All right then, people. Thank you very much for that. Like I said, we'll promote this via various fora and make the slides available as well.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you
very much, everybody.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks. Lovely.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Lovely. Bye.
Bye.